Welcome to session 81 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. So I'll tell you a little bit about the series if you're new to it, but I want to announce right from the start which books are we looking at. I've got them all here in one hand. They are the famous Harper Hall Trilogy by Iain McCaffrey, consisting of Dragon Song, Dragon Singer, and Dragon Drums. You notice there's a musical theme there, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And these were set within her Dragonriders of Pern larger series and narrative universe. They kind of stand on their own, although the characters that they introduce will play an important role in some of the later works. And just on a personal note, I will mention that these three books, not these three volumes, which I got from the library, but these three books, many, many years ago when I was just a middle schooler, were my first introduction to Iain McCaffrey as an author and to her Dragonriders of Pern series. So I'm really happy to be coming back to them. One of the intentions of this series was to allow me to do some guilty pleasure reading, to go back to books and authors and series that I knew I had loved in the past and to see what they're like through the eyes of an older adult rather than a young kid or a teenager or a 20-something. And these really do still deliver. They're great works. So, Worlds of Speculative Fiction, if you're new to this series, what this is an ongoing talk series that began in 2016, partnering with the Brookfield Public Library, held in person until the COVID lockdown in 2020, where we couldn't do it anymore. What the series is looking at worlds, narrative worlds of speculative fiction authors. So fantasy, sci-fi, alternate history, horror, weird, and many other things that fall under the rubric of speculative fiction. We look at the world building, we look at philosophical themes, we look at all sorts of other interesting matters within the works. Oftentimes, I'll discuss some of the critical reception of the author or what the author, him or herself, had to say about their works, and occasionally we do a bit of biography as well. In the COVID lockdown, we put it on hold for a while, and then when it became clear that we weren't going back to the library anytime soon, I started up the series again in this format that you see right here, where we premiere a video that I've shot ahead of time, which goes anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes. Following that, we have some live chat during the actual video premiere, so if you're here for the first time, you might be able to get in on that. But following that, we actually have a more intimate video conferencing session with Zoom so that we can discuss the works and their themes, characters, plot, and all that sort of stuff, geek out about it together more fully. So you might want to settle in. There's a lot more to come. These are some really great works set within this very interesting narrative universe. There's a lot for us to talk about. We'll be going into the world-building glimpses that we see in these volumes. We'll also be talking about some of the really important philosophical themes, some of which have to do with ethics, some of which have to do with personal identity, some of which have to do with the nature of music and our connection to animals, because, we have these interesting creatures that play a really important role within this. So we'll talk about that. We'll look at what McCaffrey herself has to say about these works, and we'll cover a lot of ground. Buckle in. We've got a lot coming at you. The first thing that I think might be helpful for us to go into as we start exploring this trilogy is a little bit of biography or chronology, we might say. Now, I've provided a much fuller biography of Anne McCaffrey during the session that we had years and years back, so I don't need to go over all of that, but I kind of do want to talk about where these books fit in. So, Dragonriders of Pern, the series, we could say that there's actually several different periods to its development. And, I mean, if we want to be real sticklers, we could say there was what was going on in the late 60s and early 70s. But I'm going to lump that in and say that the first 6 books of the series, including this trilogy here, count as an initial period. And then after that, once these have become like a really big going concern, we're going to get more novels and some short stories coming out written just by Anne McCaffrey over a series of years. And then eventually she'll begin collaborating with her son, Todd McCaffrey, and he'll continue on things. There's also, a little bit of work with another one of the children, but we can put that aside. So let's come back to the early days of the series. So Dragonriders of Pern, there's an initial trilogy, we could say, but interestingly, some of the development of that initial trilogy is going to overlap with these books as well. So how does that end up playing out? We have Dragonflight coming out in 1968, and this is taking material, really 2 stories, Where Search and Dragonrider, originally published in Analog Science magazine in 1967. And by the way, those also, were Where Search won the Hugo Award for Best Novella in 1968. Dragonrider won the Nebula Award for Best Novella in 1969. So these are some pretty heavy-hitting stories. So they're put together into one book, Dragonflight. And then not that long after that, 1971, we get Dragon Quest. So we've got a pretty rich world being sketched out, something kind of innovative with respect to dragons, which we're going to talk about as its own theme in a bit. And, the people that are involved with the dragons and this world of Pern that is being sketched out, which we'll talk about in just a bit in terms of world building. So we've got those going on. And then it's actually going to be a few years, 1976, before Dragon Song comes out and introduces us to a new character and new preoccupations. We have Madeline, who is the main character of Dragon Song and Dragon Singer, and these are going to center on the worlds of the Hold and also Harper Hall, as we're going to see in just a bit. And so Dragon Singer is going to come out, and that is a direct continuation. I mean, almost literally picking up on the last sentences of Dragon Song, we get Dragon Singer, right? And Dragon Singer is incredibly compressed as far as the narrative goes. It details 1 week of Madeline's life, whereas Dragon Song is a number of months, right? And then what's going to happen? Well, so I mentioned an initial trilogy, but you didn't hear me talk about 3 books, did you? In Dragon Singer and Dragon Song, we have a very interesting phenomenon that is talked about, narrated, which is the hatching of a special dragon, a white dragon, who is going to be discussed in the book, The White Dragon, which comes out in 1978. So, 76, 77, White Dragon comes out in 78, which brings it to, you could say a successful close. The first trilogy, while the second trilogy is ongoing, covering a lot of the same sort of ground, introducing a new point of view of Jackson, who has an interesting predicament. He's got a dragon that's too small. He's also, in line to be a lord holder, but he also is going to be a dragon rider. How's that going to work, right? So we've got all of this interesting stuff happening. And then 1979, so very close in time, we get Dragon Drums, and we get a kind of change of point of view. The key character, Pimer, however you want to pronounce his name, who is introduced as a really significant friend, ally of Melanie in Dragon Singer, winds up becoming the main point of view character in Dragon Drums. And it's connected with all sorts of interesting political matters, which we got to see hints of in the earlier books as well, and which are being, to some degree discussed in the other Dragonriders of Pern. So by 1979, we have the original trilogy, and then we have the Harper Hall trilogy. Now, the original trilogy are sci-fi novels that are written for adults, right? These are viewed as young adult. And young adult is kind of a misnomer because in general it's naming 12 to 18-year-olds. Obviously, you're not an adult legally until sometimes 16 to 18, depending on where you live. But it's sort of an initiation into things. And these are bringing to Anne McCaffrey a whole new set of readers. And, these were originally pitched as a way to reach a new audience, to bring new people into it. And very interestingly, McCaffrey is, because of these novels and because of, arrangements and advances, she's able to get a mortgage, buy a home, take care of her family. And so she gets this home called Dragonhold for the dragons who bought it. And her son will say she first set dragons free on Pern and then was set free by dragons. And we also see an interesting change, we could say, in point of view. There's still dragon riders heavily involved in these novels, right? But here, it's the Harpers, but not just the Harpers who are involved, because the Harpers themselves are a very, in some respects, hidebound with some of the characters, but also dynamic organization, especially under Master Robinson, the Master Harper himself. They're engaging in, we could say, information gathering, spying, changing the culture, supporting the Dragon Riders, at least some of the Dragon Riders, not all of them, because there's some splits involved in that. And we get to see pictures of that happening in these. I want to say two other things about the chronology and let's call it young adult matter as well. So yes, these are young adult novels. That's their classification. You can read them, as I did recently, as an adult and find them just as great as they were when you fit the description of being a young adult as a kid when you read them. And sometimes we have this idea that young adult is dumbing things down. Not the case with these at all. There's another thing I want to say, and this is a little bit more autobiographical on my part. So these are the books that I first encountered, and then I started reading the other Dragonrider of Pern books, and I greatly preferred these as a middle schooler. And I will say that middle school for me was quite a lonely time of my life. I went from public school to, kind of a rural public school where I knew all these kids, to a private school where I was there on scholarship. I was not one of the rich kids, and there was not a lot of overlap between rich and smart there. So, and they kind of let you know about that. So it was kind of a lonely time. My dad died when I was 11 in the summer in between 6th grade and 7th grade, which, was just an absolutely devastating blow for my family. Of course, my mother was in grief. Me and my younger sister were as well. I remember, coming to 7th grade and they were all supposed to tell about, what did you do over your summer vacation? I was like, what in the hell am I going to say? And I ended up saying, I watched my dad get sick and die. And then, of course, everyone was quiet about that. And so it was kind of hard to relate to. And these books were kind of a lifeline for me. I discovered them at the Waukesha Public Library, really around the same time that I discovered another important trilogy that I related to, which was Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea, followed by Tombs of Atuan and The Farthest Shore. And Madeline was a character who I could very much relate to in terms of feeling misunderstood and the loneliness and feeling out of place, but also her great love for and almost impossible to turn off improvisation with music that's called tuning in these books. And then finding out that there were places for that, finding out that there were people that you could kind of connect up with. That was what I'd hoped for, and I hoped for having friendships like that between her and PMR in these books as well. And so these books made a huge impression on me as a kid. I won't deny it. And I think they may have for many other people. I have read a lot of stories of people providing testimony about what the engagement with these books and those characters did for them. Everything ranging from dealing with loneliness to recognizing abuse to seeing a way forward out of that. So that's a little bit of chronology on my part, just to give you an idea of when that was happening. So I would have been going to middle school from 1981 to 1984. These books were relatively new. They were in paperback. They were easy to find in libraries and drugstores and wherever else you would get your hands on books. So that's, for me, I was reading them shortly after they had come out. And then, as middle school progressed and I went into high school, I read the other ones as well. This is, to come back to the central part of the chronology, this is the first part of Anne McCaffrey's Dragonriders series. 6 books, 2 different trilogies. And then it's going to be a while before she starts publishing other books in the series that start going further back in time, that start going further ahead in time, and filling in a vast narrative exploring the continent of Pern and exploring its timeline. So for a while, these and the first 3 Dragonrider books were really all that we had to go with. And then, of course, it expands into a vast universe as well. The last time that we looked at the Dragonriders of Pern series was in year 2 of Worlds of Speculative Fiction, so that's a long time. We have to spend a bit of our time here then on discussing the narrative universe that all of this takes place within, particularly these 3 Harper Hall novels. So everything is happening on a world called Pern, and it's because of this that the series is, as Anne McCaffrey has declared many, many times, actually a science fiction rather than, as one might guess, just reading these books alone, a fantasy series. What does it have in common with fantasy? A medieval sort of world, and we could say certain medieval-esque sensibilities, as we'll talk about in just a moment. But this is actually a world way out in the middle of the universe that was colonized originally by human beings who had a much higher level of technology, some of which is rediscovered in much later books in the series, which we're not going to get to or talk about here. And the world turns out to be one that's fairly low in resources, but is able to be colonized by people who want a simpler life. And then a catastrophe happens, which is really, a great central point for talking about the orientation, the structure of the social world, as well as what goes on, you could say, ecologically within it. So there is a wandering planet, the red star, that every so often will come close to the planet Pern, that all of the action, all of the lives are taking place on, the colonized planet. And when it does so, there are these spores called thread that somehow transverse the distance between the planets in space, and when they arrive in the atmosphere, they come down and they will devour and burn any living organisms that they come in contact with. So that includes human beings, that includes animals, that includes plants, which has some pretty important effects for crops. When they hit the ocean, they actually are consumed by the fish, so they're inactive in the oceans and presumably ponds and lakes and things like that of Pern. But if you're a human being or an animal that is stuck out in threadfall and you get hit by the thread, it can kill you or it can damage you pretty badly. And it's something that people are very afraid of. And so this leads us to what the remedy for this is, and that is Dragonriders. And we see, the Dragonriders have a pretty significant presence in all three of these books. Of course, they're centered on the people who are Harpers. Even the first book, Dragon's Song, Madeline is involved with a Harper who then dies. She wants to become one. Her family holds her back from that. All of that is connected with it. And then the other books are centered on that. But they're very closely connected with the Dragonriders. Now, why do the Dragonriders ride dragons? Because the dragons themselves are oriented towards fighting thread. And how do they do this? They chew a stone, which allows them to create fiery breath, and they fly up in the sky. And as thread is falling, not over the entire planet, but in selected areas, the Dragonriders burn the thread as it is coming down. And we'll talk a bit about dragons and about fire lizards and the particulars of them in a bit. The point is, this is a society that is in some part centered around survival mechanisms, and the dragons are an important part of that survival mechanism. So they are the military force, if you like, because there's not a lot of warfare involved in this, but they are the protectors of these spores that are coming down from the sky. And so that is one of the central features of Pern. Now, every once in a while, things get a little wonky because the thread doesn't come down, and then people are like, I don't know if we need these Dragonriders anymore. And there is a proposal that they should somehow attack the Red Star itself and destroy thread there, which, at least at the time of these books, is it's not even a non-starter, because one of the Dragonriders goes off and tries to explore and winds up almost getting killed as a result. So that's part of the structure. As I mentioned, it's a kind of quasi-medieval setting, and what we find is there are four main classes or types of people living together, working together, loving, reproducing, doing all the things that human beings do within these different interpenetrating settings. So we've already talked about the Dragonriders. They have their places that are called wares, and each of these is, a vast subterranean, often set in caves, type of domicile with lots of social structure and rank going on. In part because based on the dragon ranks, which we'll talk about again in just a bit. And they have a rather looser, in some respects more tolerant, but very oriented towards their mission kind of society going on. They're held in high esteem. They are given, you could say, support and resources by the holds and by the crafts and by other people as well. And so the Dragonriders play an incredibly important role within it. And let's put them to the side a bit. Then we have the holds. And the holds are the places where the bulk of economic work is being done. They could be primarily oriented towards harvesting the sea with fishing, involving, not just fish as meat, but also oils and all sorts of other things as well that you get from fishing. They could be agricultural. They could be oriented towards other matters as well. And then we have the people who have particular crafts. And what we find with the crafts are that they have a traditional medieval structure of apprentices, journeymen, masters, and the craft, of course, that we get to learn the most about in these Harper Hall volumes are the musical crafts, primarily centered around the harpers, but also including a lot of other subdivisions as well. And you progress by, learning your craft and by existing within this vast domain. Eventually, you'll be sent out as a crafter to other places, other holds, to the wares, to perhaps even on missions, as we see happening with Piemer, and also Sibel as well, this other important character that we'll talk about shortly. So all of this is part of the craft structure. So now we've got wares, we've got holds, we've got crafts. So you notice one thing. There's no, as opposed to Western medieval settings, there's no clergy. There's no religious establishment. Instead, we have effectively the guilds, we have the producers and political authorities, and then we have those who fight the thread and have dragons who they have a very close symbiotic relationship with. What about other people? There are what are called the hold lists, and these could include merchants who move from hold to hold. These could include refugees and fugitives. These could include all sorts of other people as well, and they have to find ways to exist in a world in which, at least at certain points in time, thread is falling occasionally from the skies in vast quantities, and they have to find some way to be safe. Now, I will say this as well, and this is a theme that we'll look at a bit more when we come to discuss the philosophical themes in greater detail. This is not a completely static society. As a matter of fact, it is, like most medieval societies were, as opposed to the popular misconceptions of them, a society in transition, reacting not just to environmental factors, but also to social developments, incorporation of new technology, which isn't just a matter of artifacts, but also you could consider songs to be certain kinds of technology in this, or practices that people have, or social organization. We find that Madeline is somebody who's written songs that wind up being considered important for what is going on within this world. So that is a, let's call it, rudimentary introduction to the world in which Mentally, the main character of the first two books, and somebody who plays a role also in Dragon Drums, and then Piemer, who's introduced to us in the second book, but becomes the main character in Dragon Drums. This is the world that not only do they live and act in, but they have been shaped by and are going to be, to some degree, participating in movements to reshape that world themselves. Fire lizards, which are like dragons but much smaller, perhaps like cat-sized or so, play a massive role within the Harper Hall novels. It's a time when people are starting to seek them out and even impress them the way that you would a dragon, to have one as sort of a companion or pet. And Menely is going to stumble into this and become the woman with the most fire lizards in total. So I'm going to read you a few passages that reveal this aspect of these books that I think so many people were fascinated by when they came out. Not just, dragons that you can have telepathic connections to, which are massive, building-sized things, but these little fire lizards that, as we'll find out much, much later in the series, dragons were actually bred from. So we have Menely out seeking these crab-like creatures, and she runs across a bunch of fire lizards, and there's a queen, golden one, and what we find is that the queen wants something from her. And what is it? So the queen has a clutch of eggs that look like they're going to be in trouble. And so Menely ends up moving the eggs, actually making a little cave for her. And she's talking to the queen, saying, "Did you understand me?" Menely pointed to the waves more vigorously dashing up the small beach. "The tide is coming in. Dragons couldn't stop it now." Menely put another egg carefully in the sack. As it was, she'd have to make 2, maybe 3 trips or risk breaking the eggs. "I take this," she gestured up the ledge, "up there. Do you understand, you silly beast?" Evidently, the little creature did, because crooning anxiously, she took her position in the ledge, her wings half extended and twitching as she watched Menely's progress up to her. And she does manage to relocate the eggs, and then there's this interesting reflection. However did the little queen know I could help her? No one had ever suggested that fire lizards were stupid. Certainly they'd been smart enough for endless turns to evade every trap and snare laid to catch them. The creatures were so clever, indeed, there was a great deal of doubt about their existence, except as figures of overactive imaginations. Menely could have sworn the little queen had understood her. How else could Menely have helped her? That proved how smart the little beast was. Smart certainly enough to avoid the boys who tried to capture them. Menely was appalled. Capture a fire lizard? Pen it up? Not, Menely supposed with relief, that the creature would stay caught long. It only had to pop between. Now, going between is a sort of teleportation, but it actually goes to an in-between area, which is very, very cold for brief moments. This is what dragons can do, but it's also what fire lizards do as well. So a little bit later, Menely is evading Thread. Thread is falling in the sky, and she's in there with the queen as the eggs are hatching. And some of them are going out right away and flying into the threadfall. No sooner had the blue emerged from the safety of the cliff than she saw the thin, writhing silver of thread descending. In a moment, the blue was covered with the deadly filaments. It uttered one hideous shriek and disappeared, dead or in between. And she's trying to keep them from getting out of there. And she says, "Please, little queen, do something. Stop them." The thrill of being witness to a hatching of fire lizards gave way to horror. Dragons had to be protected because they protected Pern. In Menely's fear and confusion, the little fire lizards were linked to their giant counterparts. A little bit of foreshadowing there. She turned to the other lizards now, begging them to do something, at least until the thread fall was over. Desperately, she plunged into the cave mouth and tried to turn the little fire lizards back with her hands, blocking their progress with her body. She was overwhelmed with pangs of hunger, belly-knotting, gut-twisting hunger. It took her only a moment to realize the driving force in these fire lizards was that sort of hunger. That was what was sending them senselessly forth. They had to eat. She remembered that dragons had to eat too when they first hatched, fed by the boys they impressed. Mentally grabbed wildly for her carry sack. With one hand, she snatched a fire lizard back from the entrance. With the other, a spider claw from the sack. The little bronze screeched once and then bit the spider claw behind the eye, neatly killing it. Wings beating, the bronze lifted itself free of Meneley's grasp, and with more strength than Melanie would have thought the newborn creature could possess, flew its prey into a corner and began tearing it apart. Meneley reached out randomly now and with some surprise found herself holding the one queen in the clutch. She snagged 2 spider claws from the sack in her other hand and deposited them in the queen in another corner. Finally, realizing she couldn't hand feed the whole clutch, she upended the sack, spilling the shellfish out. Newly hatched fire lizards swarmed over and after the spider claws. Meneley caught 2 more lizards before they could reach the cave mouth and put them squarely in the center of their first meal. She was busy trying to make sure that each new fire lizard had a shellfish when she felt something prickling her shoulder. Surprised, she looked up to find the little bronze clinging to her tunic. His round eyes were whirling, and he was still hungry. She gave him an unclaimed spider claw and put him back in his corner. She tossed the little queen another and snared several other spider claws for her specials. Not much more of the newly hatched got out, not with a source of food nearby. She'd had a fair haul in the sack, but it didn't take long for the hungry fire lizards to devour every last morsel. The poor things were still sounding starved as they creeled about, tipping over claws and body shells, trying to find any scraps overlooked, but they stayed in the cave. And now the older fire lizards joined them, nuzzling or stroking, making affectionate noises. Utterly exhausted, Meneley leaned back against the wall, watching their antics. At least they'd not all died. And threadfall is over. The little queen began to hover in the cave, squeaking an imperious command to her followers. Then she darted out and the old clutch began to follow her. The fledglings, moving awkward, made their virgin flight, and within moments the cave was empty of all but Meneley, her torn sack, and a pile of empty spider claw and fire lizard shells. As it turns out, Meneley has impressed many of these fire lizards. And we're going to find that, there's all sorts of interactions. She sings to them, she feeds them, she oils them. We find her rendering fat in order to oil their skins, right? They love to be oiled lying on their backs, their wings spread for balance, curling around her hand as she spread oil on their softer belly hide. They hummed with delight at the attention, and when she'd finished each one, the creature would stroke her cheek with a small triangular head, the glistening eyes sparkling with brilliant colors, which we're going to learn about a little bit more later on. She was beginning to find individual traits among her 9 charges. The little queen was exactly as she should be, into everything, bossing everyone else, as imperious and demanding as a sea-holder. She'd listen, however, very quietly to Meneley, and she'd listen to the old queen, too. But she paid no heed to any of the others, though they were expected to obey anything she said. She'd peck them fast enough if they disobeyed her. There were 2 bronzes, 3 browns, a blue, and 2 greens. Meneley felt a little sorry for the blue. He seemed to be left out or picked upon by the others. The 2 greens were always scolding him. She named him Uncle, and the greens became Auntie 1 and Auntie 2. 2 was slightly smaller than 1. Because one of the bronzes preferred to hunt for rock mites, while the other was deft at diving into pools for fingertail, they became Rocky and Diver. The browns were so much alike that for a long time they remained nameless, but gradually she found that the largest of the trio usually fell asleep. Given any opportunity to do so, she called him Lazy Bones. The second was Mimic, because he always did what he saw the other doing. And the third was Brownie, for lack of any other distinguishing feature. The little queen was Beauty, because she was, and because she took such elaborate pains with her grooming and required much more attention and oiling than the others. She was forever digging at her talons with her teeth, spreading them to clean between the toes, or licking any specks of dust from her tail, burnishing her neck ridges in the sand or grass. At first, Meneley spoke to her creatures to hear the sound of her own voice. Later, She spoke with them because they seemed to understand what she was saying. They certainly gave every indication of intelligent listening, humming or crooning an encouraging response when she paused. And they never seemed to get enough of her singing to them or playing her pipes. She couldn't exactly say that they harmonized with her, but they did hum softly in tune as she played. In Dragon Singer, we're going to find that she's now in Harper Hall, and some people get to assist, including Piemer, with the feeding of these 9 charges. There's also a lot of hostility on the part of some people who don't like that or feel envious of her. And, there's so many passages that we could read, but we'll just look at a few. So, Menely is in Master Schonegar's place, and he's teaching her how she ought to properly sing. And he says, "Young Piemer, come forward." Menely looked around in surprise, wondering how long Piemer had been sitting quietly by the door. "The other morning, Menely, our ears were assailed by pure sound and descant to a chorus. Piemer seems to be of the opinion that the fire lizards will sing for or with anyone. Do you concur?" "They certainly sang the other morning, but I was singing too. I do not know, sir." "Let us conduct a little experiment then. Let's see if they will sing when invited to." Menely winced a little at his phrasing, but Piemer's wry smile told him this was Master Schonegar's odd version of humor. "Supposing I just sing the melody of the chorus we were doing the other morning," said Piemer, "because if you sing with me, they're still singing with you and not along with me." "Less chatter, young Piemer, more music," said Master Schonegar, sounding extremely bass and impatient. Piemer took a breath properly, Menely noted, and opened his mouth. To her surprise and delight, a true and delicate sweet sound emerged. Her astonishment registered in the twinkle in Piemer's eyes, but his voice reflected none of his inner amusement to her reaction. Belatedly, she encouraged her fire lizards to sing. Beauty flitted to her shoulder, wrapping her tail lightly around Menely's neck as she peered towards Piemer, cocking her head this way and that as if analyzing the sound in Menely's command. Rocky and Diver were less restrained. They flew from their perch on the sand table and, rearing to their haunches, began to sing along with Piemer. Beauty gave a funny scolding sound before she sat up, one forepaw resting lightly on Menely's ear, and then she took up the descant, her fragile voice rising sure and true above Piemer's. His eyes rolled in appreciation, and when Mimic and Brownie joined in, Piemer backed up so he could see all of the singing fire lizards. Menely made herself listen critically, as the master was undoubtedly doing, but she found little to criticize. She hadn't taught the fire lizards how to sing. She'd only given them melody to enjoy. They had enjoyed it, and they were expressing that enjoyment by participation. Their voices were not limited to the few octaves of the human voice. Their piercingly sweet tones resonated through their listeners. She could feel the sound in her ear bones, and from the way Piemer was pressing behind his ears, he felt it as well. So isn't that interesting, connecting the two grand themes, uniting all of this together, besides, the characters, of course, fire lizards and the human connection to them, and the incredible role of music. A little bit later on, we're going to find out that there are clues to what fire lizards are feeling. Menely tells this thing. Look, their eyes tell you the green is dominant, which is sleeping pleasure. Red means hunger. Blue and green are sort of general shades. White means danger, and yellow is fright. The speed of the eye whirling tells you how intensely they feel about something. What about him, then? And Sibel pointed to Lazy, whose eyes were first lidded. Well, he's called Lazy Bones for good reason. I wasn't playing a lullaby, except when he's hungry, he's that way. And so Sibel ends up getting to learn about the fire lizards by engaging with these browns and bronzes, right? Sibel is going to, later on, as we find out, get himself a queen. All right, so we have that scene here where there's a hatching going on of an egg for the Master Harper, Robinson, and for Sibel. So they don't know which egg is which, Robinson, unable to take his eyes off the bronze fire lizard, fumbled for the piled meat and shoved food into the fire lizard's open mouth. The little bronze, shaking its wings out for balance, snatched ferociously at the meat. Gobbling so fast, Menelae held her breath for fear the creature would choke in its greed. Not too much, make it wait, talk to it, soothe it, Menelae urged. Just then the other egg split. It's a queen, shouted Sibel, who was a journeyman, rocking back on his heels in the excess of his surprise. Only Lord Groga's quick hand on his back kept him from falling over. Feed her, the Lord Holder barked. But I'm not to have the queen. For one split second, Sibel started to turn and offer the queen to the Harper. Too late, Menelae shouted, diving forward to intercept the gesture. She jammed meat on Sibel's seeking hand and then pushed it back into the frantically creeling queen. You're supposed to have a fire lizard. It doesn't matter which. The Harper was oblivious to the exchange. Master Robinson, he was intent on his bronze, stroking it, feeding it, crooning to it. The little queen had gobbled Sibel's initial offering, her tail wrapping so firmly around his wrist he could not have disengaged himself had he managed to sustain his moment of sacrifice. So we get to see, somebody else impressing them, by design this time, and the effect on human beings. We also get to see this with Piemer. Very late in Dragon Drums, he has stolen what turns out to be a queen egg from somebody who really shouldn't have had it. And he's on the southern continent, and he's been taking care of the egg all this time. So, something moved on the sand near his egg. A sand snake? He picked up the first yellowtail fish, poked a figure in the gills of the hooked one, and made for the beach. Nothing was going to... Surprise and consternation halted him for one panic-filled instant as he saw the cause of the motion. A tiny, glistening, golden creature flapping awkwardly across the sands, piteously screaming. Wild wherries materialized in the sky, drawn by some uncanny magnet to this birth moment. All you have to do is feed a hatchling, Menelae's calm advice rang in his ears as he stumbled across the sand and nearly fell on the tiny queen. He fumbled at his belt for the knife to cut up the fish. Use pieces about the size of your thumb or else the hatchling will choke. Even as he tried to cut through the tough fish scale, the little fire lizard darted forward, screaming with hunger. No, you'll choke to death, cried Piemer, pulling the fish tail out of the fire lizard's grasp and hacking chunks from the softer flesh along the spine. Shrieking with rage at being denied food, the little queen began to tear at the fish flesh. Her talons were too birth soft to perform their function, so Piemer had time to slice suitable portions for her. I'm slicing as fast as I can. A race ensued then between the hunger of the little queen and Piemer's knife. He managed to keep just a slice ahead of her voracity. When his knife opened the softer fish gut, she pounced, mumbling in her haste to consume it. Piemer wasn't certain if fish entrails, full of thread no doubt, were a suitable diet for a newly hatched fire lizard, but it gave him time to cut more flesh. He started on the second yellowtail, putting it first to occupy her while he hacked rapidly at the flesh. He knew that one was supposed to hold the fire lizard while one fed it to form the impression, but he didn't see how he could contrive that till he had food enough to coax her into his hand. Finished with the offal, she turned back to him, her rainbow eyes glaring at him as they whirled redly with hunger. She gave a scream, opened her still wet wings, and dove on the small mound of fish pieces. He caught her first, holding her body firmly under the wings, and then proceeded to feed her piece by piece until she stopped struggling in his grasp. The edge of her hunger assuaged, she paused long enough to chew, and her voice took on a new, softer note. He loosened his hold and began to stroke her, marveling at the wiry strength in the slender body, at the softness of her hide, at the liveliness of her, his very own fire lizard. So, that's Piemer getting his own. And, the people who do well with them, as Menelae has pointed out, are those who can connect, if the fire lizards are empathetic, people also need to be empathetic, caring, kind, in order to form a real bond. Now, we also get to see something else interesting that happens as Sibel and Menelae are, searching for Piemer in the southern continent. And she asks him, "You're not worried about Piemer, are you? Something you've kept from me?" And he says, "No, girl, I've kept nothing from you." Her anxious query seemed at this moment more of an accusation to him than a plea for reassurance, and he had answered with more asperity than was customary. I didn't mean to snap, I just don't know what has gotten into me. And, she's wondering what's going on. He has a queen. She has a queen as well. And here we go. She glanced skyward where the fire lizards were aerially following the skiff in swoops and glides. She watched them for a long moment. Frowning slightly, she saw one dive into the waves. Sibel, puzzled by her abrupt curiosity, identified the fisher as his own Kimmy. Smiled indulgently as she brought the neatly captured yellowtail back to the prow of the ship. Sibel wondered why the other 3 fire lizards didn't come to share the feast, but the thought didn't absorb him long. The ferocity with which Kimmy ate fascinated him. He felt as if he were somehow involved in tearing the strips, as if he could savor the warm, salty flesh in his mouth, as if, "I'm sending Beauty to Torek at Southern Hold. She can't stay here now, Sibel." Sibel heard Melanie's voice, but made no sense of the words. His entire attention was concentrated on the unusual actions of his fire lizard queen. And what's going on? She is in heat and ready to mate. The why suddenly penetrated Sibel's fire lizard linked confusion. Kimmy eating alone savagely, mentally sending Beauty, another queen, away. Kimmy glowing golden and taunting the bronzes, her good friends, with their staring, whirling, orange-red eyes. Kimmy was about to fly, and it was Melanie's bronzes who would fly her. A surge of elation swept Sibel, who could scarcely believe his good fortune. And yet, mentally, he turned to her, hands outstretched, palms up, pleading with her and apologizing for what he knew was about to happen, since there were only the 2 of them on this becalmed boat in the middle of the wind-still sea. He hadn't wanted mentally coerced as she must now be. He'd wanted to be in full command of himself, not overridden by the mating instinct of Kimmy. "It's all right, Sibel. It's all right." Smiling, mentally put her hands in his and let herself be drawn into his arms where he had so yearned to have her. And as they fly, the fire lizards, in their mating dance, we find that Meneley and Sibel do as well. Sibel and Meneley were together, lips, bodies, hearts, and minds, as they, linked by and in the love of their fire lizards, experienced and repeated the joy that enveloped Kimmy and Diver. And I think that's a good place to end with this little glimpse into not only the lives of the fire lizards, but what it is that their relationship with the human beings who impress them leads to and opens up for them. There's some really interesting observations there about what it is throughout these books that fire lizards afford to human beings and the growth that can happen within these human beings because of this relationship between them and these other creatures who, the dragons, the great dragons, were, as we find out much later, originally bred from. There are not a lot of in-print interviews with Anne McCaffrey, but there are some, and there's also what we could call an unofficial biography, as well as interviews with that biographer. So there are some interesting things that we might want to look at and think about and discuss. And the first one is from the Worlds of Anne McCaffrey FAQ. So it's not an actual interview as such, but something that the author herself thought, well, people ask me this often enough, so why don't I just address this? She's asked, what inspired you to write the Pern series? And she answers, back in 1967, I was sitting in my living room in Seacliff, Long Island, wondering what sort of creatures I could use in my next story. Since science fiction is a what-if form of fiction, I suddenly wondered, what if dragons were the good guys? Then I had to develop a planet which needed a renewable air force, which is a phrase that she'll use later on, against some unknown menace, and came up with Pern, dragons, thread, and humans who impressed a hatchling in a lifelong symbiotic relationship. Rather wonderful to have an intelligent partner that loves you unconditionally. Who wouldn't like a 40-foot telepathic dragon as their best friend? By the time my then children got home from school, I knew how it would all start. Lessa woke cold. I finished Ware's Search by summer, and John W. Campbell bought it immediately for Analog magazine and asked me to do more stories about Pern. Then in another interview with Genre Chick, she's asked, which was your most difficult book to write and which was the easiest? So this is quite interesting. The most difficult, she says, was, I think, Dragon's Dawn, as I had to lay the groundwork for any future novels. Dr. Jack Cohen came to stay with me. He's a generalist scientist, knows enough about the other ologies to give you a basic understanding. The easiest was Dragon's Song, because I had it all worked out in my head before I started to write. I actually knew several girls and fellows whose families did not appreciate their innate talents, nor would they help them. So isn't that an interesting phrasing for this first book about, what the central theme is? I think that's, dead on. It's not just about dragons or fire lizards or, the sociology of this world. It really does center on this character mentally and a unreceptive, even hostile family and little portion of society that she's stuck in, and how she's going to successfully deal with that by a sort of flight and revolt and making meaning and a life for herself, as well as finding herself then in different situations, in the Ware, in the Harper's Hall coming up, in Dragon Singer, and then, taking on missions later on. So that is quite important there. And then we can move to the unofficial biography by Robin Roberts, Anne McCaffrey, A Life with Dragons. So I'm going to read you a long selection here from the work that I think raises a lot of interesting issues. She writes, she would turn to writing some of her most successful and critically acclaimed science fiction novels, beginning with Dragon's Song, the first novel in the Harper Hall trilogy. Anne wrote to Virginia about Todd explaining, quote, on the strength of the contract for Dragon Wings Song, is in question marks, he can go to college next year. These novels are sometimes classified as young adult novels because the protagonist is a pubescent girl named Madeline, but while the novels are shorter than some of Anne's other novels, they are also enjoyed by adults. As she'd done earlier, Anne tapped not only into her own experiences as an adolescent, but into her own emotional intensity, honed by her relationships and her mother's death. The books expand on our factual knowledge of Pern, introducing a new kind of dragon, the diminutive fire lizard. In this series, Anne further develops the world of Pern, a misunderstood and unappreciated child. The main character, Madeline, has musical gifts but is denied the opportunity to use them because she is a girl. And on Pern, at this time, only men can be harpers, the planet's performing historians and educators. Ireland's own legacy of bards can be seen in the Harpers. Madeline has to run away from home and in the process impresses 9 fire lizards and eventually finds training and recognition for her work. Although Madeline is a much younger character, there are certainly parallels in Anne's own running away to Ireland, where she was able to develop her own talent, writing, and eventually receive recognition and achieve independence. Von Hassen, who works with Virginia Kidd, says that Annie is Madeline, meaning that this character contains Anne's personality. But the novel provides a good example of how an author works many elements of her life into her work. Anne recalled and represented her own adolescent angst and her own sense of being an outsider. Madeline's musical gifts parallel Anne's own musical talents. Anne's father was not the tyrant poor Meneley's father is, but Anne is channeled into this patriarch, her anger at the sexism she encountered, not only in jobs, but also in the science fiction world and as a single mother. Anne's bonds with animals, cats, dogs, and horses appear in the relationship Menely has with her fire lizards, who respond to her emotions and to whom she can cry, as Anne did with her horse Ed. The fire lizards, and indeed even the larger dragon, can be seen as stand-ins for children. For a dragon rider or fire lizard owner must feed and care for the creatures as though they were infants. Even her son's experience, her son Alex's experience with fishing boats emerged in the book, since the fishing world that Menely grows up in is depicted as harsh and dangerous. Throwing herself back into Pern provided salubrious for Anne. Menely's problems were more solvable than Anne's own losses of her mother and her lover, and as the writer in a science fiction world, Anne could create bonds with lovable fire lizards and full-size dragons that were more intimate and rewarding than those with real people. In the real world, your family, friends, and lovers could die or abandon you. Fire lizards and dragons are telepathic. And in the case of dragons, when you die, they die, and vice versa. No nasty living on without your loved ones. And she goes on and writes, in Dragon Singer, Anne appears to have drawn on elements of her experience at Stuart Hall, the exclusive boarding school she had attended for 1 year. Anne, a northerner at a southern school, was as much out of place as Menely, a fishing hold girl, is at the Harper Hall School. She endures taunts and feels very lonely and out of place. What saves Menely is her music and her fire lizards. Of course, Anne uses creative license in that she extrapolates the classic science fiction quality of taking something that is real, relationships with pets, a difficult school experience, and developing and extending it logically beyond what is known. So very interesting observations there about taking the raw material of one's own existence, one's own experiences, and pushing that into a science fiction, a speculative fiction setting, which then allows these themes to be worked through and, also brought to happier resolutions, simpler, less messy resolutions than real life. In an interview with Robin Roberts in Science Fiction Book Club, John Grayshaw asks, how did McCaffrey get interested in dragons? What is it about the Pern universe that made McCaffrey want to write so many stories set in it? And, she's drawing on conversations with McCaffrey. So she says, well, Anne said the dragons were not based on horses. She loved horses and talked about one horse, Ed, as her strength and refuge. I see Anne's revision of dragons as part of a zeitgeist in the 1960s, when Asimov, for example, was re-envisioning robots as being humanity's friend rather than foe. It was a time of optimism and belief in positive change. Humans need partners to help them advance and survive, and dragons were a vehicle for partnering with beings other than human, a way to be rewarded for being, notice this, not just tolerant, but empathetic with other forms of life. Dragons also offer women a source of power and are clearly phallic, like rocket ships. I think Anne would have liked to have lived in Pern, and it was also the most popular of her series. Anne often said that Ireland, where she moved in the 1970s, looked like Pern, stony mountains, and so forth. Now, that Pern's renewable air force idea, where we come back to that, looking at something that Anne McCaffrey herself authored, a long overdue and definitive explanation of Pern's renewable air force. So this is about the dragons. She says, in the beginning of Dragon Riders on Pern, females rode green or gold, males rode blue, brown, or bronze. Since greens are females and tend to be loving, they mated with any dragon they fancied. When not enough girls elected to stand on the hatching grounds after the first disastrous plague, males with feminine personalities impressed the green dragon. Blue riders, not to mince words, were gay with masculine temperaments. Browns, who were not so inclined to mate with a green's rider, made an arrangement so that two pairs of riders were involved in a green's mating. The dragons act the way in the way they were biogenetically designed. So we're getting some of the backstory here. That's coming out in the books, but this is like the definitive statement on that. The reason why the dragons impress only certain candidates presented to them is due to a factor built in by Kitty Ping Young, the bioengineer who designed them, using metasynth, an alien chemical compound which could often alter certain functions of those receiving it. After the particular abilities of the indigenous fire lizards were observed by two biologists, an attempt was made to treat a newfound clutch with metasynth. Their empathy with humans improved considerably. It wasn't until thread began to fall and the colonists needed a renewable air force that the possibility of creating larger animals with the same innate abilities, telekinesis and fiery breath, that the genetic material of the dragonettes was used to create a new creature. In the course of designing the new creatures, Kitty Ping employed metasynth to provide a telepathic link between dragon and rider, building on the empathy already apparent in the dragonettes. She gave additional thought on how else it could be used to improve the new dragon species and ensure that only the best, strongest, cleverest would propagate the species. While the main and most important application of the metasynth was to increase mental function and innate empathy in the dragons, a secondary use was to allow the newly hatched dragon to recognize the most suitable symbiotic partner. Hatching, the dragon recognizes by the sweat pheromones the appropriate sexual partner. Therefore, the dragonette just out of its shell would approach only the male or female candidates exuding the proper pheromones for its basic sex type. Therefore, there's a valid bioengineered reason for the draconic choice on the hatching ground and why browns, bronzes, and queens make heterosexual impressions, and why I have particularly asked that it not be altered. Now, this is a reference to all of the fan universe, including games, fan fiction, that we're going to talk about a bit later, because this is a very interesting feature of what has happened with this narrative universe. Anne McCaffrey creates it. She tries to retain more or less structural control over it. Fans sometimes oblige and sometimes don't. So, coming back to her statement, she says, "Why has this never been mentioned before? Possibly because no one has asked, and also because in the initial 7 books, there was no knowledge of the bioengineering that went into the dragons, and certainly no way to describe the advanced technology until Dragon's Dawn. However, Dr. Jack Cohen, a reproductive biologist of international reputation, is quite willing to verify this was part of our original schematics for the Dragons of Pern. And why I find it so offensive that this particular canon of Pern tradition is being altered by those who feel it might add something newbie, bigger, better $6 million Mark VII in the ever-unfolding saga of Pern. Lesbian gold riders are impossible as gay bronze riders are, and the same holds true for brown female riders. They just ain't possible, given the nature of the Pernese HLA draconic selection. Now, the Pernese Renewable Air Force was also not just womped up at an odd moment, since I've known quite a few pilots, including my son, and I did, after all, go through World War II and watch the evolution of different types of planes for different job descriptions. Let me say once again, there are generally a third more greens than any fighting wear, since they are the fighter pilots whose skills often save the larger and less flexible dragons from getting thread scored. Any wear leader welcomed with great relief the presence of each new green rider. But since the greens are small and have exchanged speed and maneuverability for stamina, they generally fly only half of a fall, being sent back to the wear to rest, returning only if a fall lasts longer or is heavier than normal. The blues are stronger, have a wider thrust of flame, can last an entire fall. The browns are stronger yet, with a wider and longer thrust of flame. Another reason they're often appointed as winged seconds. The bronze, of course, is the strongest of the fighters, having great depths of reserve and the most potent flame in length, depth, and duration. The bombers, you might say. They are invariably wing leaders with 2 wing seconds, either or both of which can be browns. The queens don't like to be left out of the action, and flamethrowers were their method of defense, since they can't digest firestone. They fly low as the best way to catch whatever thread might escape the upper level flights. Back to the different sexes involved. The greens, like their little cousins, are extremely affectionate, flirtatious, and when in season can be quite a problem to the were-leaders. However, some long-term unions were formed between greens and any of the other colors, bar the bronze, who always hope to make the queen theirs in their next mating flight. The greens oblige any of the males, including bronzes, or we'd have a heap of sexually frustrated, very unhappy male dragons. As the green is wholly heterosexual, larger and stronger than even the largest bronze, and certainly any browns, she mates infrequently and only when she feels an irresistible urge to procreate. To be totally whimsical, she's Catholic, you might say. Nevertheless, she's not as amenable to being caught as the greens are. She makes quite a show of her sensuality, evades and taunts all the dragons rising with her in a mating flight. As she is larger and stronger, her stamina is considerable. The bronze that catches her has to be the smartest, strongest, and fastest of the flight. The higher he can take her before linking with her, the longer he has to impregnate her, which means a stronger and larger clutch. The stronger the impact of that mating is on the 2 riders also improves the clutch, since the male is not inhibited by the queen rider's indifference. If were-leader and were-woman are totally compatible, clutches invariably reflect that accord and include more of the larger dragons and possibly a queen. There's a rational chain of command for very obvious reasons, especially during threadfall, right? I designed my Pern Air Force quite carefully, and if it seems sexist to readers in this decade, I make no apologies for the world I designed 30 years ago. Long before it ever occurred to me that the world of Pern would be online and subjected to alterations that contradict its basic traditions and canons. This is my world, folks. I designed it. I haven't changed the design. So very interesting explanations, declarations, metaphors that Anne McCaffrey is letting us in on there. Here's a follow-up to this, and this is from 1992 in a user group. And she's asked about Pern, and this has to do with the dragon's sexuality. This is also going to, as we're going to see in Dragon Drums, affect fire lizards too, and fire lizards and their owners. So she says, it's like this. When dragons mate, their riders are so consumed with their dragon's passions, the telepathic link, that there's really only one way to vent it, enjoying the sexual act themselves. The double whammy is something incredible. Since most green riders are male and most blue, brown, and bronze riders are also male, the obvious need not be stated. However, it's permissible within the wares for the less enthusiastic about this pairing having an alternate of the opposite sex available. The green rider will also have someone of his preference available, so the double charge is not lost. If you don't mind me being a little bawdy. Actually, many of the candidates are were-bred and accustomed to such demands and think little of it. It's the main bone of contention between the hidebound halls and holds, so the crafts and the holders, and the wares, the dragon riders. For the halls and holds don't really like such innovations. That is, looser sexual relationships and gender roles that allow homosexuality or bisexuality. And then she goes on and says, still the writer is always compelled by concern for their dragon, and that consideration makes the difference in a sexual situation. Also, it's an incredible experience, one to be treasured. And yes, there could be more female riders of green dragons to relieve that dilemma, but after the early plagues, women were needed more as mothers to increase the population, something men haven't been able to do on their own, and flying constantly between is how to abort on Pern. Queen dragons are not always as horny as the greens, and as they are low-level thread fighters, their pregnant riders could generally manage without constantly going between in the performance of their duties. Anyway, I thought homosexuals deserved a place in the elite social structure on Pern. So this is very interesting, and I'm going to just make a quick remark here. So McCaffrey, on the one hand, is writing in a way that introduces and calls into question sexual orientation, sort of like a heteronormative way of doing things, reflects her relationships with, very close relationships with gay men in the course of her work and studies and things like that. Not lesbians, though. She actually talks about being hit on and, rejecting that. And at the same time, considered from the perspective of later decades, winds up seeming, in some respects, too rigid and regressive. So, there's more that could be said about that, but I'm going to reserve that for perhaps further discussion. Now, some other things that she says, coming back to fire lizards, the key, the dragons play a role in this. They all have, dragons something or other, but the fire lizards are the little dragons that everybody gets to see so much of and talks a lot about in these Harper Hall novels. There's some great stuff about that she's clarifying in Sabrina's Guide to Online Pern, a little bit of everything Pern interview with Anne McCaffrey. So she asks Anne, do fire lizards speak telepathically in words or just empathic images? There were some points in the books where I wasn't sure. So Anne clarifies, fire lizards don't have words. They express stronger emotions and can pick up the mood of the people they're beholden to. They can occasionally, the queens and the bronzes, project images or scenes to their people. So no language, but visual images, emotions as being key there. Then she's asked, I was wondering if fire lizards go between when their people die. Because dragons, if their people die, dragons go between and die there. So Anne says, fire lizards merely return to the wild if their friend dies. They're not on a self-destruct sequence. They usually return to the place of birth like a salmon. There is, in later books, one fire lizard who does go between afterwards. Then she's asked, how intelligent are fire lizards? Does the color of the fire lizard affect this? Are they as smart as a cat, a non-Pern dolphin? An IQ range or rating or range would give me an idea. And Anne says, IQ, that's not really appropriate here. But she says, color affects intelligence. The golds and the bronze being smarter, and the greens being really bubble-headed. Fire lizards are as intelligent as the most intelligent cat you've encountered. Now, that's actually a great rating, isn't it? Because think about cats that you've interacted with or seen. Some cats are pretty damn smart, right? Some cats are pretty stupid, and there's a wide range in between. So she goes on and says, dragons' intelligence is on a different scale, more like dolphins. Certainly not horses, who are pretty dumb animals, though you do have some smart ones within the parameters. And, you should know better than I. The problem, or rather the boon for dragons, is they don't remember events. How would you get them to go fall after fall? They do have some very fine instinctive response to situations. So that's some interesting clarification about these empathetic, intelligent animals who bond with human beings for life. Then we get some information that's also particularly germane to these novels in the Harper Hall trilogy. Other than Harper's, what forms of entertainment exist on Pern? Are the traders much like the gypsies of Earth and sometimes dance, tell fortunes, etc.? Does Pern have anything like a circus? Maybe a performing troupe that travels with the traders from hold to hold, maybe a magician or trained animals. So Anne McCaffrey says, and I really like this beginning set of words, I think. Now, isn't that an interesting thing for an author to say about the world she has created? I think Singing, dancing are the main entertainments on Pern, plus card games and the usual that follow any human civilization. But as there are no trained bears, cats, dogs, except spit dogs, I think things would be relatively innocent pleasures. TV has certainly reduced the art of conversation to minimal exchanges. Sleight of hand, possibly. They wouldn't subjugate fire lizards in the role of tricksters. That's demeaning. I suppose there's always folk who need to have the future told, palmistry, but the traders are not Roma so much as they are honest traders. Lilcamp is, after all, a corruption of Lillenkamp, Joel, the commissary chief, racing too as Ruatha breeds speedy runners. There's a follow-up question. Would there be people who do acts at gathers? And gathers play an important role in Dragon Singer and Dragon Drums, right? Like jugglers, contortionists, acrobats, ground or mounted on runners, tightrope, comedy or clowns, or others who put on a thrilling show to amaze the masses. I wonder what a rider would say to someone who wanted to do an aerial act, maybe a stunt involving hanging from a trapeze or rope, or hanging from the claws or harness of a flying dragon. And Anne says, traveling entertainers did not go with the colony group, and all the acts you mention would take professional guidance and expertise to perfect. Let's say that very energetic dances stand in for the other. No aerial acts either. Enough are seen on Dragonback to satisfy that craving for danger. You might have stand-up comedians, sleight of hand, but not much more. Singing and playing instruments would give the performer considerable cachet. I don't see the other forms of circus entertainment being brought with them, and I certainly don't mention them in this. And the travelers, tinkers, people like that were too civilized by that time of history. Lord, even the tinkers in Ireland are leaving the road and settling down. So, interesting narrowing of the forms of entertainment on Pern. So clearly, Harpers are at the complete center of this, and we have many, many scenes in this book where the Harpers are, really central to the culture, not only at Harper Hall and the other craft halls, connecting with them, but also within the holds. Each hold has a Harper who is teaching and transmitting culture and entertaining at different points in time. That's where, Melanie gets her training in the first place. Also within the wares, Harpers are important there as well. So, some very interesting clarifications, interviews, biography that I think helps to flesh out the narrative world and the intentions of the author that are playing a role in these Harper Hall novels. When thinking about the philosophical themes that run throughout these Harper Hall novels, there's a number of them that come to mind, but the one on my rereading of these that really sticks out to me is what we could call the interplay between the individual and the larger society within which they find themselves. A society which is rather traditional, but also in the middle of important changes, some of which are being, you could say, promoted by some of the key characters, like, the Harper master, who is, fairly clear-sighted about this, some of the ware leaders, some of the holders, and there's all of these interesting and intersecting hierarchies that are involved, some of which make sense, some of which don't make as much sense, and the question is, well, what do people do with this? And it really does center around the main character of Menely, and, to a lesser extent, particularly in the third book, Pimer. And they're trying to figure out where they actually belong and where they can do what matters to them most. What kind of life can they live? And there's quite a few people who are content to exert power over others so long as they can have somebody to look down upon. The girls, at least some of the girls in Dragon Singer, the people in Menely's hold, including her family, who are rather traditional that way, with the exception of one of her brothers. Even some, the were leaders who take off for the southern continent and then are engaging in some covert action. The Lord Holder, who dies in dragon drums, who's also working with them, and who's dying of a stinking, rotting disease. There's all sorts of interesting accommodations that people are making. And I just wanted to bring up a few interesting passages that, give us some insight into how Anne McCaffrey is working with these characters. And I do want to say this. There is no character who is saying, the social system that we have needs to go completely away. There's no radicals in that sense. But it is about a continual humanization of the structures that they have. So we start with Meneley at Half Circle Hold. And we find out that Petteron, who is the Harper there, had tried to live long enough for his replacement to arrive. He told Meneley he wouldn't last the winter. He dispatched a message to Master Harper Robinson to send a new Harper as soon as possible. He also told Meneley that he'd sent 2 of her songs to the Master Harper. "Women can't be Harpers," she said to Petteron, astonished and awed. 1 in 10,000 have perfect pitch, Petteron had said in one of his evasive replies. 1 in 10,000 can build an acceptable melody with meaningful words. Were you only a lad, there'd be no problem at all. Well, we're stuck with me being a girl. You'd make a fine, big, strong lad, you would, Petteron had replied exasperatingly. And what's wrong with being a fine, big, strong girl? Meneley had been half teasing, half annoyed. Nothing, surely, nothing. And Petteron had patted her hand, smiling up at her. And Mr. Robinson's a fair man. No one on Pern can say he isn't. He'll listen to me. He knows his duty, and I am, after all, a senior member of the craft hall, being taught up in the craft before him himself, and I'll require him to listen to you. So, Meneley has great musical talent. She also has talent for other things as well, as we're going to discover. And what's holding her back is traditional gender roles. And we find that her family winds up being, dismissive, abusive to her. And she finds her place really in 3 different, we could say, locations. In a sort of self-imposed exile, the cave that she has with the fire lizards, who she impresses and brings up and plays music to and sings to. And then, she is caught up by the Dragonriders and taken to Bend and Ware. And there she sees a very different sort of environment. She's being treated in a way that was quite different from her hold hall. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, at the end of Dragon Song, she is taken to Harper Hall, and that's where Dragon Singer is taking place, and also, a part of Dragon Drums as well. And there she has a different way of fitting in. She doesn't fit in well with the girls. As a matter of fact, she's actually going to get in a fight towards the end at a gather with not just one of the girls, but the girl's, I guess you could say, boyfriend, paramour, punches him in the face as he's going after Pymer. And, she's going to sort of fit in there, and it takes a little while for her to find her place. And then, interestingly, Pymer in Dragon Drums, he has a beautiful tenor voice, and then as an adolescent, his voice changes. And now, what is he going to do? He gets sent to the drummers for a while, doesn't fit in well with them, finds out that his talents actually lie in observation and spying and subterfuge. So, it's a matter of figuring out, where you actually can be. So I want to bring up this passage as well. This is actually a really important turning point, not just for Meneley, but for many readers who were affected by this. So this is at Bend and Ware. Lessa departed, leaving Meneley the object of intense scrutiny. Felina, a tall, willowy woman with very beautiful curved black eyebrows and green eyes, gave her a long appraisal, sent one helper off for clothing from a special press, another to get the tanner to take Melanie's measure for footwear, a child for her shears because Melanie's hair must be trimmed, and who had hacked it off? They must have used a knife. And such pretty hair, too. Was Menelaie hungry? Tegelen had snatched her out of the cavern without a yea, nay, or maybe. Bring that chair here and push that small table over. Don't stand there gawking. Get the girls something to eat. How many turns do you have? Felina asked on the end of that long series of orders. I've 15, please, answered Melanie, dazed and trying very hard not to cry. Her throat ached, and her chest was tight, and she couldn't believe what was happening to her. People fussing over how she looked and what she wore. Above all, Lessa had smiled at her because she was so pleased about the clutch, and it seemed that she didn't have to worry about being sent back to Half Circle. Not if the werefolk were ordering her shoes and giving her clothes. 15. Well, you wouldn't need much more fostering, would you? Felina sounded disappointed. We'll see what Minora has in mind for you. I'd like you as mine. Melanie burst into tears. That provoked more confusion, because her fire lizards began swooping dangerously close to people's faces. Beauty pecked at Felina, who was only trying to offer comfort. Let's have some order here, said a fresh, authoritative voice. Everyone except the fire lizards obediently subsided, and room was made for Minora. And you be quiet, too, she said to squealing Beauty. Go on, she waved at the others. Go sit somewhere, quietly somewhere. Now, why is Menelaie crying? She just burst into tears, Minora, said Felina, as perplexed as anyone else. I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm happy, Menelaie managed to blurt out, each repetition punctuated by a heaving sob. Of course you are, said Minora understandingly, and made gestures to one of the women. It's been a very exciting and tiring day. Now you just drink this, the woman had returned with a mug. Now everyone will go about their duties and let you catch your breath. There, that's better. And, what's going on there? Menelaie is not used to being treated as if she matters. She's used to being treated as if she's always wrong and in the way and can't do things the way that she ought to be doing and doing stupid things like making music. Well, that's really going to be the center of her existence, as we're going to find in Dragon Singer and Dragon Drums. And I should point out, Dragon Singer, a lot is happening in this book. It's all happening within 1 week after she's brought from the Weir to Harper Hall. There she has to find her way as well. And so, I'm going to read you a few passages from that as well. So Menelaie has been able to engage in some direction of singing, and that was a really interesting experience for her. And we see all sorts of things like this, getting to participate in complex song enactment and crafting, right? Forming these interesting relationships, learning more and more about the fire lizards and how they interact with others. So, here's an interesting line. Listening to the rehearsal was not quite the same involving experience as directing. Then, Menelaie had felt herself to be an extension of the choral group. Now she found it objectively interesting to observe Bredegen's direction and think about what she would do with the same passages. About the time she decided that he was an exceedingly clever director, she realized she'd been setting herself in comparison with a man in every way superior in excellence and training. Menelaie almost laughed aloud. Yet she reflected, this is what life should be in a Harper Hall. Music, morning, noon, afternoon, and evening. She couldn't have enough of it, and yet she could now see the logic of afternoons spent on other chores. Her fingertips ached from the harp strings. Her scarf felt hot and pulsed. She massaged her hand, but that was too painful. She'd left the jar of numbweed in the cot, which meant she'd have to wait until after threadfall to get easement. She wondered if the girls knew what went on in the Harper Hall during threadfall. Hadn't Pyrmir said they were up at the hold during fall? She shrugged. She was far happier to be here. And so we get a kind of nice encapsulation of realizing what it's like to not only be in one's proper place, but for it to be complex, to be part of a greater whole, to have purpose that is being recognized, to know that this isn't the end either, but the opportunity to grow into more. And this is a possibility not only for the Harpers. I mean, music is the overall grand metaphor for discussing this. And because music encompasses many voices who have to harmonize with each other. Sometimes dissonance can be, damning to a piece. Sometimes it can be incorporated into it. But you can see this as well in the descriptions of other crafts. For example, that of the miners in Dragon Drums, that of the Dragonriders in the other Dragonriders books, and to a certain extent in these. That of people engaged in cooking, in cleaning, in watching over others, in herding, in gathering fruits and herbs and things like that. Again, in Dragon Drums, right? So there's this possibility for at least some of the characters, of not being the proverbial round peg shoved into the square hole, but actually finding a place where they belong. But it's so contingent. It depends not only on one's own innate talents, or what one can do, or one's disposition, but also on the, not just kindness of others, but the intelligence of others as well. There's another interesting passage that I want to bring up, also from Dragon Singer, and this is Master Shonagar talking with Meneley, and he says, "I don't know what it is about you, young Meneley, that you can disrupt an entire craft hall, for you are not presumptuous. In fact, you are immodestly modest. You do not brag, nor flaunt your rank, nor put yourself forward. You listen, which I assure you is a pleasure and relief, and you learn from what you are told, which is veritably unheard of. I begin to entertain hope that I have finally discovered in a mere slip of a girl the dedication required of a true musician, an artist. Yes, I might even coax a real voice out of your throat, but I cannot do it much if you are not here." And then he said, "Sylvina," because she says, Sylvina said, "Sylvina is a wonderful woman. Without her, the hall would be in chaos and our comfort ignored. She's also a good musician. Yeah, you didn't know that. You should make the occasion to listen to her singing, my dear girl. But," again the voice boomed, Master Shonagar's belly bouncing, though the rest of him seemed stationary, "I thought I had made it plain that you are to be here without fail every single day." Right? And why? So she can learn her craft. He's not being tyrannical or, cruel or anything like that. Notice that he recognizes what is the qualities in Meneley that make her able to be taught, able to grow, right? By comparison to some of the other students who are rougher stuff. And he also recognizes other people who are similarly masters in their domain, not only for what they do, but also other talents. That let's call her the chief organizer of Harper Hall, the one who runs things, is also a great musician herself. And this is something that we see coming through. What stands in the way of people being able to find their places? Well, the rivalries, the people exploiting where they fit into the hierarchy, the insecurity that produces a need to put others in their place, not understanding, fearfulness, all of these sorts of matters can lead to breakdowns. And I think this is really well explored through individual interactions. There's nothing like a sociology of Pern going on here, but we are getting to glimpse something like that through all these different interactions that people engage in, and particularly through these really important characters, Meneley most important, Pymer, but also, Sebel and Robinson and some of the other people that are depicted in it as well. One of the topics that I briefly alluded to earlier and that I want to explore not in perhaps as much depth and detail as it actually deserves, but which I think raises a really interesting set of philosophical considerations is what we could call the fandom of Anne McCaffrey's Dragonriders of Pern, including that centered on the very compelling characters who were introduced to in these Harper Hall novels. And, you could say this is a complex matter that involves the question of, well, what does an author, a creator of, to use Tolkien and other thinkers about this, notion of secondary worlds. Pern is a secondary world. Anne McCaffrey is the creator of it, but it exists in part because she could sell books. These help to pay her mortgage. And are there any responsibilities, or how else should we think about it, that an author bears those who respond so positively to the narrative world and plots and characters that an author has created, that they want to, in some respect, inhabit it or reproduce it or make their own attempts at writing things within it? And so it's also very interesting, too, because one of the things that I guess you could say really changed matters is the transition from a pre-internet world to a world in which the internet becomes massively important, and the internet in its early days as well. So, Dragonriders of Pern spins off all sorts of interesting matters. The people that are interested in Pern would go to Dragon Con and organize their own thing called Warefest. There were all sorts of wares, the Dragon Riders, of course, that were organized to be sometimes face-to-face meetups, sometimes online. And, Anne McCaffrey had kind of a, you don't want to have too much, let everybody do whatever they can do. But on the other hand, you don't want to just, stifle things and be a tyrant. It's tough to find a balance. And there were quite a few other authors as things like fan fiction became a real going concern due to the internet. Because think about what that made possible. In the past, prior to the internet, if you wanted to do fan fiction, you could. You could write up your stuff. You could see if you could get it published somewhere and get people to read it in a zine or something like that. But odds were you're not going to make any breakthrough. Suddenly, with the internet and the possibility of groups and blogging and all that, it just exploded. There's zero cost to writing things, except perhaps if you run afoul of the author. And interestingly, Anne McCaffrey ended up sending, over the years, a lot of cease and desist letters, or rather her lawyers did, to people of all sorts, some of whom were just teenagers, people infatuated with it. And she made guidelines at different points for what people could do or what they couldn't do. For example, at one point, she said, listen, in fan fiction, you can refer to my characters, but you can't use my characters. You got to write your own characters. Obviously, a lot of fan fiction does not follow that, including the vast world of erotic fan fiction that's out there that does whatever the hell they want, And you could pick any series, but, Dragonriders of Pern really attracted a lot of that. There were also role-playing games, some of them in tabletop settings and some of them online. And some of these role-playing games were actually more like forums where fans would get together and, write up characters and then get allotted dragons on the basis of that. And so Anne McCaffrey was, on the one hand, being rather proprietary about that, and on the other hand, wanted to allow there to be some freedom, but was worried about where some of this would go. And as we saw when it came to, like, say, revising the sexuality of dragons and their riders, she's like, listen, it's this way, sort of like, it's my way or the highway, because I'm the creator. So it's really quite interesting to see. So there's lots of fan fiction. There were magazines, fanzines that were published at different points, some of them online. Some of the music got turned into CDs that would get listened to, played, swapped around. So there's all of this stuff, a vast, what would we call it? There's a secondary world, which is this growing world of Pern that is, rather new but already rich with this trilogy and the other trilogy, and then it grows throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s to encompass a vast number of books, some of which are not novels, but sort of guidebooks, and then all of this other stuff that is, let's call it Pern connected. Now, the question we can ask is, okay, none of that fan stuff is official. It's very clear McCaffrey has made that to be the case. She'll actually, sometimes when she's writing about stuff, like she'll write Pern and there's the TM, trademark thing beneath it. But what's the legacy of all of this? Is that a vaster secondary world, which is much more wide, and you could even say anarchic by comparison to the more tightly controlled world of the author, her characters, the backdrop that she devoted a lot of time and thought to developing. And finding the happy medium between these, quite difficult. So it's clear that McCaffrey had a very complicated and sometimes conflictual relationship with the fandom that was inspired by these very stories. And I don't have some sort of overall take, who's right, who's wrong, or something like that about that. But I thought it could be a very interesting topic to perhaps seed your minds with, and maybe there'll be some discussion about that in the comments below, or if you're participating in this, in the session that follows the premiere of this video. So we've covered a lot of ground with respect to these Harper Hall novels, one of which only gets us to Harper Hall, Dragon Song, the other two of which, one is entirely at Harper Hall, and then Dragon Drums is halfway there and halfway on the southern continent. So some very, very interesting stuff. I'm so happy that when I did return to these, I found them to be just as good, perhaps even better, than when I was an adolescent reading these for the very first time. And this is where we're going to end. So thanks for watching along for this entire thing. I know we've talked an awful lot about this. And if you haven't read these, go out and get them. I think you'll really enjoy them.